Determinism and freedom. What is ethical experience? Let's begin by eliminating moral imperatives, Kant, Nietzsche, etc. They all tend to explain the moral experience, unify the moral rules, and rework the table of value, or imperatives of their time, by objectifying subjective and original impulses in a moral and thus universal form. But if we do not define ethics at the level of man in society, of man at work, in the street, or at home, we fall into a parasitical form of literature which may be easily accounted for in terms of the social function of the moralist. What is left to consider then? Social objects with a common ontological structure, which we shall call their norm. These objects are of different sorts: institutions, particularly laws which prescribe conduct and define sanctions; customs, which are diffuse and uncodified, and which are manifested objectively as imperatives, having diffuse and uninstitutionalized sanction; and finally values, which are normative, refer to human conduct or its consequences, and constitute the object of axiological judgment. We shall come back to institutions later. It isn't easy, at the level of the superstructure, to distinguish them clearly from customs. Law and custom are sometimes indistinguishable. The injunction not to kill is both an imperative of the penal code and a diffuse moral prohibition. Conversely, in certain circles of the ruling classes, legal prohibition against defrauding the Internal Revenue Service is not accompanied by any moral prohibition. In other instances, those, for example, concerning private customs, moral imperatives are not accompanied by legal prohibitions. The law punishes lying only in very specific cases. Morality always strictly forbids it. We shall call ethics the totality of imperatives, values, and axiological judgments constituting the commonplaces of a class, a social milieu, or an entire society. This does not mean that each person actually behaves in conformity with them, but each upholds them as a regulation or a prohibition. For example, in a poll taken in a girls' school, of those asked the first question, "Do you tell lies?" 50% answered often, 20% very often, 20% sometimes, 10% never. But 95% answered yes to the second question, "Should lying be condemned?" and only 5% no. These dual responses give a rough indication of the objective nature of the regulations. The same individuals, all or nearly all of them, uphold them, yet do not hesitate to break them. Why this contradiction? Is it that they want to impose upon others a law they do not obey themselves? No, they impose it on themselves. The existence of the law reassures them. If lying is unconditionally permitted, it becomes reality, and truth is no longer anything but a lying appearance. Everything becomes identical. I can't do anything but lie. Kant defined the reassuring character of the imperative. Thou ought, therefore thou can. The liar would rather reproach himself for having lied. The prohibition against lying tells him he can always not lie. What is common to the different objective forms of ethics, as to ethics itself and institutions, is a certain connection with possibility. A given act imposes itself a priori as unconditionally possible. These two terms are worth explaining. The term possible, by the very fact that it is connected to the term unconditionally, is in strict opposition to positivism's conditioned possibility. For positivism, the social agent is contingent but strictly conditioned. He is the point of intersection of a series of external causes. Each of these causes is external to the others, and the internal condition of each present cause has an external antecedent cause. If all the different series involved were known, the behavior of an agent could be strictly predicted, that is, reconstructed, at any instant. Since certain series provisionally escape understanding, the pattern of behavior includes an element of indeterminacy in relation to prediction. At any given moment, several ways of behaving are predictable, and each of them constitutes a possibility. Thus, for positivism, the possible, in the realm of human behavior, becomes, as the indeterminacy of our knowledge, an objective and subjective factor in our behavior. An agent will perhaps undertake a given action only because he is unaware of the conditions, social, psychophysiological, historical, and so on, which will actually keep him from carrying it out successfully. Although his undertaking ends in failure, it will make him different than he would have been if, knowing all of the series, he had not undertaken anything. For positivism, prediction, as the result of a reasoned calculation about a pattern of behavior, makes a previous future of the future. The positivist makes the future a past which will be confirmed, and the present a realization of that future which was its past. The agent's being becomes a frequentative, expressed as the eternity of external pasts appearing as past futures, whose conditions are always given in, and therefore always predictable in terms of, past presence. The past dominates everything, and the "it will be" is no longer anything but a "this was predictable," hidden by a future. Man is external to himself, in the same way as time and space are. An imperative testifies to a possibility which is the complete opposite of the one we have just described. It knows no conjuncture, that is, no connection with antecedent causes. It would be more accurate to say that it does not want to know any. The literature of every age has described those do-or-die situations in which an imperative, although it is indeed carried out under determining conditions, is carried out by being torn free from these conditions. Honor, the feudal value of patriarchal families, has been presented over and over again as an unconditional demand. The agent can always save the family honor. He cannot always win. That does depend upon external conditions. But honor is saved if the agent gives his life to save it. When he had 3 to fight, what did you expect one man to do? Die. The fundamental possibility shifts. 1. On condition that one put his life at stake, every moral requirement is capable at the limit of being met, no matter what the antecedent and external determining conditions may be. And 2. Everybody's most profound possibility consists in the possibility of staking his life on an imperative. We are, of course, talking about a do-or-die situation. Thus, an imperative presupposes that man is always capable of preferring such and such a way of acting to a causal series whose limit is life itself. This unconditional rejection of external determining factors means granting that the agent has an inner power beyond the power of external causes to determine his conduct. In other words, instead of being passively acted upon by external causes, as one billiard ball is by the impact of another, the agent determines his behavior as a synthetic unity in respect to them on the basis of that other internal synthetic unity, the imperative or value. Norms are not a combination of independent parts. An imperative, for example, is an objective whole or unity of interrelations which governs its various parts. Thus, a norm, as unconditional possibility, defines the agent as a subject in awareness who is the synthetic unity of his diversity. The norm does not bring this subject into relief by simply prescribing an act to a subject already existing in self-awareness, but by affirming that such a subject in awareness is always possible, in spite of any possible set of external circumstances. Only a subject in awareness can fulfill a norm. A subject designated as such only realizes himself by doing the prescribed duty. In this sense, the fundamental possibility revealed by a norm is the possibility of making oneself a subject in awareness, in connection with external conditions, by doing one's duty. In other words, the norm appears to me as my possibility, which is an objective characteristic of the norm in the sense that my possibility is at the same time everyone's possibility. But it is to the extent that it reveals me as the possible subject of the act, whatever the content of that act, which does not for the moment concern us, may be, that it reveals my possibility of producing myself as subject. So now we can see the meaning of the girl's answers to the question about lying. In the exhausting circumstances of everyday life, they are insisting that the possibility of being a human agent be always kept open, in spite of circumstances, by an unconditional prohibition. In a word, an imperative is directed toward my possibility of producing myself as an autonomous existent who affirms himself by dominating external circumstances and refusing to be dominated by them. This is the way the normative actually appears to us. Its unconditional possibility is imposed upon me as being my possible future, regardless of my past. The fact that the accidents of birth and childhood have made me cunning, or that lying has become a habit for me, or that antecedent circumstances render such lying useful, makes little difference. These facts do not touch the possible subject of the normative act in his possibility. Thus, he constitutes himself as a future independently of any past whatsoever. Even more, he constitutes himself as the future which claims to establish itself on the ruins of the past. In this way, he directly opposes the positivist future, which consists of external circumstances coming back again on the offensive. The norm, on the contrary, in its aspect of permanent possibility of making me a subject in awareness, makes its appearance as pure future, future which is in no way determined by the past. Thus the imperative is the determining of my present through my possibility of producing myself in opposition to, or independently of, my past. As such, this possibility cannot be the object of any possible knowledge. Not only is there nothing in the past determinations of the world and of myself which would enable me to foresee, even probably, my answer to the question, but I can, on the contrary, sense with anguish that everything is making me foresee that I shall not know how to answer it. Many members of the resistance used to ask themselves, if they torture me, will I be able to keep from talking? No doubt the percentage of those who talk and the overall probabilities of talking, according to the treatment received, can be statistically determined and a tactic established. Hold out for 24 hours. But it is just such past predictions which do not concern me. It's a question of my producing myself now, whatever the percentages may be, as one of those who do not talk. The imperative's pure future is neither knowable nor predictable. Its character as pure future, that is, as future which nothing has laid the groundwork for and nothing helps to bring about, makes it a future to be created. Of course, I run the risk of discovering outlines of this future, systems of means which will help me bring it into being. In order to keep from talking, I'll try to make out as well as I can, to play the role of someone else, to create this future, in short, out of what is presently given to me. But to do so is precisely to explain the present through the mediation of the future. It's not a matter of knowing the future through the present, but of knowing the present through the future. The present immediately takes on the synthetic unity of a field of action. In the torture chamber, the prisoner, who has in mind the norm, I must not talk, looks all around him and tries to foresee the tortures in order to discover psychophysiological means of resisting them. There is no place for the norm. So talking becomes, abruptly, a possibility of the self-aware subject. This is not simply the triumph of external determining factors. It's the internal decision to let oneself be determined by external factors, by anti-norms and anti-values. Thus the norm, the most ordinary as well as the most exacting, is understandable as the future which must be created, and is capable of determining the present simply because it is given as an unconditional possibility. We ought not to be deceived by the imperative aspect of duty any more than we are by the imperative aspect of values, which are effective imperatives connected to practical imperatives, unconditional possibilities of loving, admiring, and respecting these men or these objects. Duty, for example, as it presents itself in customs, has the structure of a commandment, which is, as a matter of principle, an order given by someone else, and which, in the eyes of the agent, retains this character of otherness. Like values, the claims of duty have a certain fixity, which seems to permeate them with a strange inertia. Nothing allows us to say that the ontological structure of a norm does not seem to be deflected or distorted by the introduction of alien causal factors. And it is here that positivism, in its effort to limit the harmful effects of its causal analyses, is instructive. In fact, positivism reveals its irrational game, its Pythagorean scandal, when carrying the classic banner of the 19th century, ethics and science, it discovers and describes the normative character of customs. This pure future, which defines the possible agent as an awareness that has to create itself, is manifestly incompatible with the world of the past-present, the prior-future, and externality. And norms, as necessary possibilities, are especially contrasted to the purely affirmative contingency of facts. Up until this point, except for customs, positivism has discovered nothing but facts. It is so constituted that it cannot discover anything else. But what about norms, someone will say? Well, exactly, the positivist says, recovering his self-possession. Since I discovered them in objective experience, this means they are facts. Henceforth, after our original description and discovery of a norm as pure future of awareness, we must admit that positivism is right, and recognize, as it does, that norms are also facts, and, what is more important, repetitive facts. This conclusion follows from two considerations. 1. Past societies, and with them their values and imperatives, have disappeared. In other words, their pure future, without ceasing to be a future, was a past future. It possessed the intrinsic characteristic of being the repetitive future of that society. No more than society did it, for example, resist the introduction of a new type of production, which relegated old relations of production to the past. 2. For us today, the imperatives of a present society appear, at a certain normative level, as an unconditional future, and at another level, when we are not members of this society, or when, even though we are, we become conscious in certain historical situations of our position in respect to it, as a repetitive past. For the natives of Central Australia, marriage according to certain exogamous rules is a strict duty. The sentence I just uttered contains fact and norm in the same proposition. Exogamy is objectively a rule to be observed, a normative structure for each native. It is his future if he isn't married, and that of his son or his nephew later, that is, his family's future. In a word, the future presents itself to him as an oriented change. But it is also true that the same native, when he is the ethnographer's informant, speaks of this normative structure as a fact of social custom. In these parts we marry in such and such a way. This is what will be called the paradox of ethics. The content of the norm, embodied in an imperative of social custom, establishes a destiny for me. I must produce myself through my act. Awareness is from time to time the subject of my possible act, and of my possibility of making myself a subject. The possibility, that is, that any determining factor whatsoever in my past will be unrelated to my act. The past is relegated to the past, and the imperative is a discovery of the future as disqualification of the past. But this future, which posits my unconditional possibility of producing myself in awareness, simultaneously posits it as an imperative which has already been respected by individuals of preceding generations. For men in the past, it was a future. This future of mine is really a prior future. It presents itself to the moral agent I am today as my future and as a repetitive fact. I shall respect the exogamous laws as the preceding generations did. If you like, the thou ought, therefore thou can, which is an appeal to awareness through the norm, is accompanied by a this can be done or a this cannot be done. Why don't you do it this way? Because, the answer is, it isn't done. And the it isn't done, in turn, explains the empirical situation governed by the norm, or the norm as leaven of contingency. In short, the fact presents itself to me as a normative and future possibility, as unconditionally, in the pure future, society's repeated past. This ethical paradox encourages the positivist, and above all the neopositivist, to consider the norm an illusory characteristic of certain repetitive facts produced at a certain social level. Facts are the hexis, or regular practice, of given patterns of behavior. Norms are the apparent relationships which practice in the form of social role or determining cultural factor maintains with the individual it shapes. When the group or the individual thinks he is determining himself in relation to the future, he is only reproducing, in another area, and in a predictable way, the deeper lying causes, such as the relations of production, which, as facts, assign him a being, such as his being a member of a social class. In this case, the appeal of the norm is nothing but the trap which causes me to realize unceasingly my past being, the destiny I already had before I was born. And finally, it can be said that existence in awareness and externally is presented deceptively to the agent as an existence to be realized through a subject in awareness. In this case, as in the neo-positivist thought of certain Marxists, man, deceived by the illusory possibility of being his product, that is, of directly producing himself in the totalizing unity of some guiding scheme, inexorably makes himself the product of his product. My representation of my freedom is the motive which drives me to realize my alienation to the fullest. Neopositivism recognizes that the totality of the behavioral patterns making up the ethical life of a society implies, along with repetitive constants, development, the appearance of new norms, or the disappearance of old imperatives, and conflicts between what is disappearing and what is about to be born. But for neopositivism, all these facts involve deeper lying social causes and external modifications of fundamental structures. Even if value were the permanent expression of a certain number of facts, even if its normative aspect were an inessential phase of the process which causes the normal agent to produce his existence, the existence already assigned to him by the social whole, the positivist would still have to account for the normative nature of value. Mere appearance? Granted, but a universal appearance. And if, as in Hegel's thought, appearance as such has a nature, the positivist must account for the norm as the possibility of a pure future of awareness. In the preceding interpretation, after having clearly indicated the contradiction between norm and fact, he thinks it is enough to show that norms ordinarily underlie facts in order to reduce, without further ado, the former to the latter. If we try to understand why neo-positivism fails, we see that it subordinates history to system as it does value to fact. Neo-positivism is a structuralism. Society, for it, is a total and functional unity of relations. It is relationships which define and produce terms. The whole is a system which comes into existence, grows, reaches its full development in an evolutionary stage, and disappears. But this system, through the structure and function of the relationships which constitute it, contains at the outset the strict grounds for its rise and fall. From the outset, the nature of the system is taken to be a process, yet its quasi-unity is reduced to the interaction of internal relations. There is no actual presence of the concrete whole in relation to each of its parts, no enrichment accomplished through conflicts. In a word, no real inwardness. The system's sham unity, or relative unity, creates a pseudo-inwardness by protecting its development from the intrusion of external forces, but it does so in the same way that, in a laboratory, the experimenter isolates the experimental system. Since the system's development is the product of its internal reactions and its self-regulations, the observer located within the system has no future except that of the system. And there is not the slightest element within the system that would allow him to foresee what will happen after he is gone. The most one can do is grant, after a disorderly period, that there will be another system with its structures and pseudo-internal laws governing its life and death. This means that as long as a system is in a developing stage, everything that happens in it can only make it grow. As long as a system is in a declining stage, the effect of everything that happens in the system is to make it decline. Within the system, prediction is based on the laws which constitute the type of man characteristic of the system. Its upper limit is the abolition of the system, and its actual limit is ordinarily the stage which has produced the man and his prediction. For structuralism, history is an internal product of the system. There are as many histories as structured societies. Each society produces its own temporality. Progress is the development of order. This historical pluralism succeeds in subordinating history, as a movement, to the structural order. The future is still predictable, but within well-defined limits, and defined in a positivistic sense. In this sense, the future is already in the past. It will be as a prior future. It will realize, for the social agent it produces and conditions, the future being which is present implicitly in his past. In other words, the future is something to be predicted rather than created. Here, praxis is eliminated to the benefit of process. But, as Engels says, it is man who makes history on the basis of prior circumstances. Not that systems do not exist, but it is man who produces them by the objectification of his praxis, which is inscribed in the inorganic world like a seal in wax, and turns back upon him as the practico-inert. The system's unity is its own unification, perpetuated by the mediation of men, who are indissolubly the products and producers of it. Their actual practice becomes alienated in it, and tries, in opposition to it, to overcome its alienation. Thus, the historical future is partially predictable. It is alienated by the system which has been produced by praxis, and partially unpredictable. It develops within and outside the system as a future to be created, both by means of and in opposition to determining structural factors. History is the system's true unification through its practical totalization, and at times its external limit is its real inwardness, since it completely penetrates the system it sustains. History goes beyond all the structures and the entire social system. It is both the motive power which produces these structures in producing an alienated future through their mediation, and the concrete praxis which contests them in the name of a true future. It is no accident that neopositivism's historical pluralism suppresses the human agent, making him no more than the drive belt which the system makes use of for internal changes, or that certain Marxists, tempted by structuralism, are trying to de-emphasize the basic motive power of history, class struggle. We know about the forces which uphold the system in this struggle. The bourgeois, for example, are products of the capitalist system, but they unceasingly uphold it and perpetuate it, not from inertia but by choice, through their elaboration of an economic, social, and political strategy. We know about the profound ambiguity which marks the exploited classes. Prior to their liberation, they themselves contribute to upholding the system. Their need to make a living constrains them to accept the rules of the game. But their continual working on themselves, as they work at making a living, teaches them that their basic reality consists in being simultaneously the system's product and its radical challenge. When Marx writes that the proletariat bears the death of the bourgeois class within it, he means that the proletariat, through its practical negation of the repetitive future which the system imposes on it as its nature and destiny, is pure future beyond the system. We have to understand, 1, that this future is the outline of a future system on the other side of the ruins of capitalism, the one which will be born from the destruction of the capitalist system, and which it is worth destroying capitalism for. And 2, that the only way in which any abstract and schematic determination of the future system can be grasped is through the concrete and practical living negation of the present system. From this point of view, it would seem that the disadvantaged classes have at least two futures. One appears imperiously and restrictively within the system: find work, feed your family, save your pay, etc. The other is manifested as pure and total future through the rejection of the system and the production of a different system. Thus, history, in revealing itself, shows us a dual future: the local or infrastructural history which comes to men within the system from the system's structures, and the temporally indefinite history which makes each man within the system aware that mankind is a mankind to be created, not by building a system, not even a socialist system, but by destroying every system. Thus, the communist man is his own product. It seems we are falling into a difficulty greater than the previous one. We had only one future, and now we have two. But let's examine imperatives and values in the light of this discovery. Will we perhaps discover in them the relationship between the two futures? As a matter of fact, within the system itself, the norm is simultaneously an unconditional future and a limited, repetitive future. What this means is that imperatives or values are not limited internally by their ontological structure, but by an externally imposed inertia.